Just 2 weeks ago, we read at the end of the book of Bamidbar, the portion called Maseh. Eila Maseh B'nai Yisrael. These are the journeys of the Jewish people. And it reads like an itinerary of the 40-year trek that the Jewish people took in the wilderness. They journeyed from here, and they camped here. They journeyed here, they camped there. And on the Torah will go listing 42 journeys of the Jewish people in the wilderness. In a way, that's the story of each of us as individuals. Eila Maseh, these are the journeys, and put your name there. How many stops along the way? You see, ever since we're introduced to the first Jew in the Bible, the very first Jew, Abraham. And what's the first sentence told to us about Abraham? Lech lecha. Go journey. God tells him, leave the place. Leave your father's household. Go to the place that I will show you. Well, we haven't stopped traveling since. We are the world's best frequent flyers. Not always by choice. We went to Israel, we went to Egypt, back to Israel, to Babylon, to Spain, to Europe, to Africa, to India, to Asia, to Australia, to America. Over the past 3,700 years, we have journeyed across every continent. Most of the time, it wasn't by choice, but yet we keep journeying. Why? Why can't we just stay put? Why can't we just be? Just in this room alone, how many different states are represented? Jews live in every single country and every continent in the world today. So the Kabbalah teaches us that when God created the world, he scattered these sparks of holiness throughout the world, hidden spiritual treasures, waiting to be unleashed and uncovered. And it's the mission of the Jew, starting from Lech Lecha, starting from that very first mission to Abraham, to go forth and to make contact with these sparks all over the world in places we would never suspect. And King David writes about this in the book of Tehillim. He says, "May Hashem mitzadei gava, the footsteps of man are directed by God." So when a Jew comes to a particular place, there is always, I repeat, always, a divine intent and a divine purpose. Something, some deed, some mission, some prayer, some act of charity, some love needs to happen at that particular place. The journey of a Jew is never random. See, you may think you end up living in Boston or in Florida or in Texas or in Colorado because of career obligations or because you were drawn by good weather or because you happened to marry a woman whose sister-in-law's brother owned a company that you're working for. You can put some explanation down on paper. King David says, you think that's the reason. It's not true. May Hashem mitzadei gaver, God wanted you living in the place that you're living there. God engineered these myriads of circumstances because he wanted you here right now for a unique purpose. Nothing is by accident. Now, whether you actually fulfill your mission at that location, that's free choice. But the journey, the opportunity, the unique opportunity for you, that's been pre-planned by God. Now it's up to you. Will you take advantage of this opportunity? Will you fulfill your purpose? In fact, the fact that we're all here in this room together at this time is of monumental importance. The people you meet here, the people you sit down by breakfast to, the people you will sit by lunch, the people you will meet by dinner, the people you're sitting next to right now, right, left, front, and back. It is by divine providence that you're meeting different individuals. And you will simply never know the impact that such an encounter can possibly have for the rest of your lives. Because right now what's happening is that your journey is connecting to someone else's journey. It's an interesting thing because if we looked at the book of each individual, there's something fascinating that takes place in a particular page in this book. My book has now interacted with your book. You're part of my book. I'm part of your book. We're each part of each other's book of life. Our journeys somehow met up together here at this very particular moment. We're all familiar with the word bashert, right? You've heard the word bashert. And bashert is usually referring to the spouse that you met that was bashert that you met. But in truth is the word bashert simply means destiny, meant to be. And it's not just for marriage. It's for every aspect of life. Bashert, it's meant to be. Bashert applies to our journeys in life. So let me begin with a story. Some 40 years ago, Rabbi David Shachat of Toronto, Canada, was asked to lecture to a non-Jewish group in the city of Buffalo, New York. Now, he was used to lecturing to Jewish audiences, but here was a request to lecture to a non-Jewish audience. So he asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe if he should accept the offer, and secondly, if he was to accept the offer, what should he talk about? So the Rebbe responded that it's a good idea that he should accept the offer and that he should speak about the universal importance of charity. Charity goes across all lines. All human beings need to be more charitable. And so he accepts the invitation. He flies to Buffalo, and he's speaking at this particular lecture. And in his lecture in Buffalo, New York, to this non-Jewish audience on this lecture on charity, he tells a story. So now we have a story within a story. You're going to have to stay with me because there's going to be stories within stories within stories. And he tells a story that many years back in the city of Krakow, there lived a very wealthy individual. This wealthy individual never contributed a dime to charity. He was known as the miser of Krakow. Everyone knew this guy, don't even bother asking him for anything. He won't give. Now, after the miser died, the Chevra Kadisha, the Jewish Burial Society, felt that considering how greedy and selfish this man had been during his lifetime, he was given this rather unworthy part of the cemetery to be buried. It was called Hektish. It was where the John Does were buried. And that's where this miser of Krakow was buried. Not next to any of the holy people in the cemetery of Krakow, not next to any people of importance, but this separate section. And no one showed up for his funeral other than his own family. A few days after the funeral, there was a commotion in the town. Two prominent members of the community, the butcher and the baker, not the candlestick maker, who had always been extremely charitable, suddenly stopped distributing funds to the poor. Many people had relied on these benevolent individuals. Anyone that was poor knew that if you went in Thursday or Friday to the butcher and said, I can't afford meat for Shabbat, the butcher would simply just give it to you. As charity. They also knew that if you went into the baker Thursday or Friday and said, I don't have money for food for Shabbat, he would supply you with challah and cake and everything you needed for Shabbat. And this was a weekly tradition that went on for years and years and years. And suddenly that Friday, the butcher announced no more free food. The baker announced no more free food. And all the poor people in town were up in arms. What do you mean? We rely on this. What do you mean no more food? So the paupers in town got very upset and emotions ran high. And the matter was brought to the rabbi of the town, a great sage named Rabbi Yomtiv Lipman. He was known as the name the Tosfos Yomtiv, after a book he authored. And the rabbi hears the complaint of the paupers, and he summons for the butcher and the baker to come to his office. And he says to them, after all these years of such a great mitzvah, all these years of the charity you've done for this community, why did both of you decide to stop such a beautiful thing? So they said, Rebbe, we aren't and never were in a position to support this amount of people. All these years that we've done it, it wasn't us. It was the miser. He was the one that supplied all the funds. We simply kept a record for him, but it was all done on condition that no one would ever know. It was his mitzvah, but he didn't want anyone to know about it. Now that he passed away, we can't do it. And now that he passed away, we felt you should know at least that all these years, he wasn't such a miser after all. He was just an individual that didn't want the glory, didn't want the kavod, didn't want the honor. But he was the one supplying this. The Tosfos Yom Tov was in total awe of this miser's behavior. He spent hours and hours and days praying at this man's grave, begging for forgiveness for the way he was treated at his funeral, and that he, as the rabbi of the community, allowed this to happen. When the Tosfos Yom Tov passed away, he left instructions that he wanted to be buried right next to the miser of Krakow, in that section of cemetery at the plot right next to his. And that's where he's buried until this very day, side by side. Rabbi Shachat in Buffalo, New York, tells the story. He concludes his lecture. And after the lecture's over, a group of people start asking questions. And one of the individuals that came up to ask him a question happened to be a priest. And he says to Rabbi Shachat, "Can you repeat that story you told about the miser in Krakow?" So Rabbi Shachat said, "Repeat the whole story again?" He says, "Yeah, I want to hear the story again." He says, "I'm a little bit tired. I slept today. If you'd like to continue this conversation, why don't we meet tomorrow morning in the lobby of the hotel? I'll be glad to spend time with you. We can talk." Figuring the priest has other theological questions, differences between Christianity and Judaism, and he realizes it's going to be a lengthy conversation. And the priest says, "Certainly, I'll meet you tomorrow morning." They set a time, place in the lobby. Rabbi Shachat doesn't know if the man will show up or not, but certainly comes down to the lobby, and sure enough, the priest is there. And he begins by telling him over the story, the entire story again. And the priest is pacing back and forth and back and forth. And finally he says to Rabbi Shachat, "That man, the miser in your story, is my ancestor." So Rabbi Shachat smiles and he says, "I don't think so. I don't think there's any connection between him and you, because it happened hundreds of years ago. It's not a story that happened yesterday or 10 years ago. This is hundreds of years ago. And I'm not sure I made mention that the miser was Jewish. There's something about you that tells me you're not. It may be in what the clothing you're wearing that says something, the cross on you that says that you're not so Jewish, but this was a Jewish story. So the priest says, "Let me tell you a story now. I grew up in Tennessee. My father was a major in the United States Army during the Second World War. While overseas in Europe, he met a Jewish girl. He fell in love. He brought her home as his bride, and no one knew of her Jewish background. A short time after the marriage, they had a child, me, who they devoutly raised in the Catholic tradition. I grew up and attended a seminary where I eventually trained to become a priest. And I'm a very popular priest. I have a very large congregation here in Buffalo. A number of years ago, my mother became very ill. And she called me to her bedside and she said, "My son, I don't have much longer. I need to tell you something. I need you to know that I'm Jewish. And according to Jewish law, that means you're Jewish." And she said, "The only thing that I know about my ancestry is that my mother would tell me a story, that we have an ancestor somewhere that's buried in Krakow, and that he's buried next to some holy rabbi named the Tosfos Yom Tov. That's all she knew. She went on to tell me the story that he was known as a miser, but he wasn't a miser at all. At that time, I imagined that my mother had been delirious. Her parting words made me feel uneasy, but I figured it was just a fleeting thing. I got it out of my life. I forgot the entire episode, lost interest in the subject, and went on. But Rabbi, he says, you just repeated the story. Krakow, miser, buried next to the same rabbi's name. It's the story my mother told me. Now I remember her parting words. I'm Jewish, which means according to Jewish law, you're Jewish. What am I supposed to do? So Rabbi Shachat says, if what your mom said is true, and I have no reason to doubt it, you're 100% Jewish. What you should do, here's the phone number of the Chabad rabbi in Buffalo. Maybe you want to give him a call. Visit, talk, see. And Rabbi Shachat left the hotel, got his flight back to Toronto, and life went on. Fast forward decades. Rabbi Shachat's in Israel, visiting Jerusalem. He's at the Western Wall. At the Western Wall, everyone says Shalom Aleichem to each other. And some bearded man says Shalom Aleichem, and Rabbi Shachat responds Aleichem Shalom. And he says Shalom Aleichem Rabbi Shachat. So Rabbi Shachat said, you know me? He says, I know you. And where do you know me from? Buffalo, New York. Still doesn't ring a bell. He says, how's about the priest from the story in Krakow? And it starts coming to him. I'm the priest. I took you up on your advice. I started going to classes. I started learning about my heritage. I gave up the priesthood, gave up my congregation, came back to my people, made aliyah to Israel, got married. I have a large family here in Jerusalem. Ladies and gentlemen, here comes the rest of the story. Just a few years ago, Rabbi David Shachat was looking into his own genealogy, and he discovers that he is a direct descendant of the Tosfos Yom Tov. And so in that auspicious juncture in time, in a hotel lobby in Buffalo, New York, a descendant of the Tosfos Yom Tov meets with a descendant of the miser and pays back a debt of hundreds of years earlier and changes the course of destiny. There's a connectivity between us. There's a connectivity between our souls that is beyond what we can see in the here and now. Who sent Rabbi Shachat to Buffalo? Was it some invitation that he got? Or was it orchestrated from above? Who sent the priest to the lecture that night? Was it a flyer he saw? Or was it orchestrated by his ancestors from above? Now, these are the fascinating stories perhaps that we get to read about and hear about. But trust me, these stories are taking place with every single one of us throughout our lives. We're just not aware of the outcomes. All of our life's experiences, even our frustrations, our setbacks, our disappointments, or our joys and our celebrations and our successes and our victories, are journeys designed to lead us to our own promised land. God guides the footsteps of man. Each person's journey are custom made specifically for his or her needs. These journeys can either turn out to be meaningless treks that might not have ever have happened, or they can be of awesome significance, or they can be of biblical proportions. That's up to us. The Talmud says an interesting thing. You're familiar a little bit with the story of Joseph? Joseph, the guy with the Technicolor Dreamcoat? Joseph from Broadway? Anyone know who I'm talking about? So in the story of Joseph, you have Reuven, the eldest of the 12 sons of Jacob. And he tries. He's a good character in this story because he really wants to save Joseph's life. He just doesn't want to stand up to the brothers. And so he convinces them, don't kill him, just throw him in a pit. And the Torah tells us because he intended on coming back to save his brother and bring his brother back to his father. So the Talmud says that had Jacob known that his actions would be recorded in the Torah, then he would have taken his brother Joseph and carried him on his shoulders back to the safety of his father's house, regardless of what the other brothers might have to say about it. And what does it mean, had he known that his actions would have been recorded in the Torah? What does it mean that if he knew that this was going to be in the bestseller of all times, he would have behaved differently? What it means is, had he only foreseen the far-reaching effects of his actions or lack of actions at that critical juncture, how it would have affected the entire course of history, how would he have behaved? If you truly knew that the behaviors, the actions, the decisions you make are not just about today, but will affect your life for every single day thereafter, will affect your family and your children and your grandchildren every day of their lives, how would you treat each decision? You begin to understand that the journeys of our lives and the opportunities placed before us are of biblical proportion, because history is being written. And my friends, we never know which event we experience, which decision we make can be that history-making destiny decision. But what we do know for a fact is that anytime God places you in a situation where you can do a mitzvah, where you can do a kind deed, where you can do a favor for another, where you can extend yourself and bring some joy to another human being, by definition, that's a biblical moment. Take advantage of those moments. And that will create a tidal wave that will follow, that will change the individual's life that you have interacted with, change your life for all time to come. Another simple story from the Talmud. How many of you have visited the city of Tzfas? How many of you have visited the city of Tiberias? Okay, what's the distance between Tiberias and Tzfas? Huh? It's about 18 miles. It's not that far. Has any of you ever hiked going from Tiberias to Tzfas? No. Why? It's uphill. It's a long, windy road. It's hard to even drive it because it goes like a zigzag. Rabbi Yochanan and his students, the Talmud says, were walking from Tiberias to Tzfas. A long hike, a hard day's work. It was hot, they were tired, it was sunny, they were schlepping and schlepping. As they're walking, Rabbi Yochanan points to a field and says, you know that field? I used to own it. I had crops over here. It was a farm that I owned. So why don't you own it anymore? I sold it. Why did you sell it? Because I wanted to open a yeshiva for you students. And I needed the funds from that property. They passed another property. It was a vineyard. Rabbi Yochanan says to his students, you see this vineyard? I used to own it. I sold it in order to feed my students. On and on they went on this 18-mile trek. And each time he passed another property, he said, I used to own it. I sold it in order to have students. At some point, the students broke down crying. And they said, Rabbi Yochanan, you're a poor man, and yet you used to be a wealthy man. And you sold it all to the point that you don't even have a donkey to ride on this difficult hike. You have nothing left, and you gave it all away. It's so sad. Rabbi Yochanan says, sad? You call that sad? I would do it again and again and again because there's nothing more valuable than you students. There's nothing I wouldn't do for you. My friends, it's been over 1,800 years since this story took place. Since the great Rabbi Yochanan lived on this earth. Today you can go to any center of Torah in the world, in any part of the world, and you could listen to yeshiva students study the Talmud. And what do you hear them say? Amar Rabbi Yochanan once taught us this. Rabbi Yochanan taught us that. Does anyone know or care that Rabbi Yochanan once owned real estate? Does it make any difference in the world? Is anyone today talking about who owned real estate in Israel 2,000 years ago? But Rabbi Yochanan lives on. Every word of his lived on because he had students to teach it to. His journey may not have been a journey of wealth, but it was a journey that lived on until this very day. My friends, if we want to give our children something truly precious, something valuable, something indestructible that will sustain them in their journeys throughout life, give them the gifts of what matters most. A sense of connection to their past, a sense of mission, a sense of purpose. I read this book by Rabbi Benjamin Blech, quite a few times he's been at this JLI retreat. A wonderful, wonderful speaker and a great, great author. You should read his books. And he writes in one of his books about this little part of a film. It was a comedy film played by the actor Billy Crystal. And Billy Crystal in this film, I don't remember the name of the movie, his character is asked to come to his son's class and speak to the class. And he gets up and he says, kids, value this time in life because it goes by fast. When you're a teenager, you think you can do anything, and you do. Your 20s are a blur. In your 30s, you raise a family, you make a little money, you think to yourself, what happened to my 20s? In the 40s, you grow a little pot belly, you grow another chin, the music starts to get too loud, one of your friends from high school becomes a grandmother. In the 50s, you have minor surgery, but you call it a procedure, but it's surgery. In the 60s, you have major surgery. The music is still too loud, but it doesn't matter because you can't hear anyway. In your 70s, you and your wife retire and you live in Fort Lauderdale or Miami Beach. You start eating dinner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You have lunch around 10. You have breakfast the night before. You spend most of the time wandering around malls looking for the men's room and muttering, how come the kids don't call? How come the kids don't call? How do we assure that our lives don't mirror Billy Crystal's monologue? How do we pass on to our children that there's more to life than just the skills to earn an income? How to love and how to be loved. How to be a giver and not just a taker. How to fulfill their life's mission and leave a permanent mark rather than just survive. How will they learn the essential things that can have meaning and purpose in every day of their lives? And the only force that will ensure our children and ourselves with a higher sense of values and purpose is spirituality, is Yiddishkeit, a spirited Judaism, a deep sense of the soul within each and every single one of us, and the mission and the journey that we were sent on this world for. If you want to give your child something that will last, give them the gift of Jewish memories. Let them understand the greatness from which they come, the greatness which they will have the opportunity to pass on one day to their children and to their grandchildren. And so as we write our book of our journeys, let's pick something. Let's pick an item, a change as I spoke about yesterday, that we can put in this chapter, in our journeys of life, that something changed for us on this weekend. And we can tell our children and our grandchildren, or for some, perhaps our great-grandchildren. Back in the 1990s, when communism finally fell apart and Hungary gained independence from the Soviet Union, people suddenly had freedoms the likes of which they hadn't had since 1956, when Russia invaded Hungary. For the first time in decades, people were able to make their own decisions regarding the schooling of their children. And so like everywhere all over the old former Soviet Union, Jewish schools began opening all over Hungary. One such school was going to open in Budapest. A team of American teachers and rabbis came to spearhead the effort. And they placed an ad in the paper that they're planning on opening up a Jewish day school in Budapest, whoever is interested to come for a day of orientation. They were hoping perhaps they would get 50 students. On the first day of registration, on the first day of orientation, 450 children and their parents show up. They're clearly not equipped. They're a small team sent from New York. What are they going to do with 450 students? Contingency plans are made to accommodate the overflow registration, and to divide the parents into groups to interview them, into smaller groups, 10 at a time. And they ask each of these parents, curiosity, why are you here? What made you decide to send your child to a Jewish day school? And each parent had a reason why they were there. Anti-Semitism in the public schools, they remember their bubby, they remember their grandfather, they remember a tradition here, why they would want their kids in this Jewish school. At this time, there was a man sitting in the back quietly, not joining in the discussion. And finally, the rabbi asks, you haven't said anything yourself. Why are you here? Why do you want to send your child to our first grade? And the man was shy. And he said, it's difficult for me to speak in public, but I'll try. I was a child of 7 years old when the Germans occupied Hungary in 1944. They knew the war was almost over for them, but in their sick obsession to kill as many Jews as possible, they rounded up as many of us as they could to send off to Auschwitz. All Hungarian Jews were terrified. One night I'm lying in bed and I hear my parents arguing frantically. I can hear the raised voices. I came down to hear what the argument was about, but the door to the living room was locked. It was closed. And so we had the keyhole in those days. You can actually look through the keyhole. And so I peeked through the keyhole to see what was going on. Why were they screaming? Why were they scared? Why did their voices sound different? My father was very agitated. And I heard him saying to my mother, look, we don't have to worry. No one knows we're Jewish. We have nothing to worry about. We don't look Jewish. We don't do anything Jewish. We don't practice anything Jewish. There is no evidence of our Jewish identity. We'll get away with it. We have nothing to fear of the Nazis' invasion. My mother said, but maybe they have a list. I heard they're coming with lists. Maybe our name is on the list. My father said, how could our name be on the list? No one knows we're Jewish. And even if our names are on the list and they come here, they'll search the apartment. There's nothing Jewish here. We have nothing to fear. And when my father said to my mother those words, look, if the Nazis came to this apartment and they searched, there is nothing Jewish here, my mother started staring at the bookcase. Her eyes went to the top shelf of the bookcase, and my father stopped his words, and he also began to stare at the top shelf of the bookcase. My mother made her way to the bookcase and she took down from that shelf a siddur, a prayer book. It was the siddur that her mother gave her on the day of her wedding. It was the prayer book that her grandmother gave her mother on the day of her wedding. It was a prayer book that was passed on from one generation to the next. It was the only thing Jewish in the entire house. My mother opened the pages of this book and she caressed the pages, she touched the pages, she kissed the pages. She turned to my father as he nodded his head. She took that prayer book and she tossed it into the fireplace. And she fell on the floor crying in tears. I watched this through the keyhole. I saw my mother on the floor crying. I saw the burning pages of her prayer book. I was 7 years old. I ran to my room. I ran to my bed. I began to cry like I never cried before. No, I knew nothing about being Jewish. I never practiced Judaism, didn't know the first thing about being Jewish. Yet I knew that something happened there. something very painful that severed something from within me. Every night since, I have nightmares. I have nightmares of seeing that prayer book burning in the fireplace. And so you ask me, why am I here? I'll tell you why I'm here. On the first day of school, I'm going to proudly walk into this building. I'm going to hold my son's hand. I'm going to walk him into the classroom, and I'm going to hand him a siddur. And maybe my nightmares will stop. And maybe my tears will stop flowing. My friends, that's the awesomeness and the eternity of the Jew. Our journey must continue. Our journey must go on. The faith and the devotion and the perseverance of the Jewish people is on our shoulders. The journey of the Jewish people are not separate, isolated incidents. It's all part of one continuum. The past is connected to the present, and the present is connected to the future. All of our journeys are interrelated and interconnected. And yes, part of our journey was difficult and painful. And not only have we survived each and every single one of them, we have emerged from them stronger, prouder, more resilient than ever. Wherever we went, we didn't allow the flames of evil and of hatred to engulf and consume us. From out of every darkness, new light has come forth. From every tragedy and setback, there's been renaissance and renewal. From every stretch of pain and adversity, new cause for celebration and rejuvenation has taken place. We're all links in this vital chain connecting our parents and our grandparents to our children and our grandchildren. Jewish history and destiny now waits for you to actualize your life's calling by making your unique mark and contribution. Here we are in the 21st century. We're living in incredible times. We are perhaps the most fortunate Jewish generation in history because we can drive right up to a Hebrew school and hand our children a siddur with joy and with pride and without a trace of fear. We can walk in the streets on Shabbat and on Jewish holidays without looking over our shoulders to see if the KGB is following us. We can celebrate the special occasions in life. We can attend Torah classes. We can pray as a community in broad daylight. Do we begin to understand and appreciate the blessings we have and the opportunities we have? I'd like to close with an amazing story. One of my father's closest friends, back from his childhood days, growing up in Chmelnik, Poland, was a man by the name of Rabbi Meir Bucket of blessed memory. Rabbi Bucket was the patriarch of a beautiful family. Many of his children and his grandchildren now serve as Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins all over the world. Rabbi Bucket was a rebbe in yeshiva throughout the years. And in the summertime, when the yeshiva was closed in Brooklyn, he would go to the Catskills where they would have a summer yeshiva. Well, this particular summer, the summer of 1970, for whatever reason, the learning program in the Catskills was canceled. So Rabbi Bucket was home. His daughter, Rachi, who's her and her husband are shluchim emissaries in California, called their father, Rabbi Bucket, and said, you know what, you have the summer off, come to California. Come visit us. They were working on the campus in UCLA out of the Westwood Chabad House, and they invited him and the rest of the family to come. And so he makes the trip. 1970, traveling to California was considered a very big deal. They brought a train. They went by train from New York to Los Angeles, and it's coming now to the first Shabbos in California. And Rabbi Stillman wanted to explain to his father-in-law that Shabbos davening at the UCLA Chabad House is a little bit different than his shul in East Flatbush. Doesn't look exactly the same. There's a lot of hippies, the students. It's not like a shtibel in East Flatbush. And he begins to explain, it's a Chabad House, and Rabbi Bucket says, it's okay. Don't worry about me. It's Friday night after the evening service. It's time for the meal. Big meal for the campus students. Rabbi Bucket is invited by Rabbi Kunin to sit at the head table. And he says, no, I'm not sitting at the table. I want to sit with the guys. I want to sit with the college students. I want to be part of it. And he sits with the college tables, and they're singing songs, and he's pounding the table. He's really enjoying this. And during this meal, as he's rapping with these students, the guy sitting next to him is this eccentric fellow. His name was Tuvia. Tuvia was a genius. He knew 17 languages, including Yiddish and Swahili. At one point, Tuvia asks Rabbi Bucket, where are you from? He says, he's Flatbush. She says, no, where are you originally from? He said, Poland. He said, but we're in Poland. He says, it was a little shtetl. You never heard of it. So he says, try me. He says, it was called Chmelnik. So Mr. Swahili says, Chmelnik? My grandparents were from Chmelnik. Not only are they from Chmelnik, but they live here in Los Angeles. And they belong to a group called the Chmelnik Society. Chmelnik Society? Rabbi Bucket never even knew there was a Chmelnik Society. So they began talking, and Rabbi Bucket tells to Tuvia that he was an only child, and that for years and years he's been trying to find some record, some trace of what happened to his parents. But nobody's been able to tell him anything, so perhaps someone from this society would have known his parents and can give him some information. Shabbos was over. The following Thursday, the phone rings in the Stillman house. Mrs. Stillman, my name is Chana. I'm a member of a small group here called the Chmelnik Society. I'm a close friend of Tuvia's grandparents. It's very important that I meet your father. I have something very important to tell him. They make up to meet on Sunday at the Chabad house. Rabbi Bucket sensed that this was not going to be an ordinary encounter, so he asked all of his children to dress in their Shabbat clothing. And they went to the Chabad house. The woman was waiting for them, a very distinguished, elderly-looking lady. And the woman says to Rabbi Bucket, I knew your parents in Chmelnik very well. I was very close with your mother, Rachel Bucket, alav shalom. I want you to know what happened during the last days. And she tells him of the last days of the Jewish community of Chmelnik, the roundups, the deportations. She says, your mother, my daughter, and I were in a boxcar together. We were being transported to the Treblinka death camp. We stayed close to each other throughout that harrowing journey. While we were traveling, I looked up and I saw this little window, this tiny opening on the top of the car. And I noticed that every so often the train would slow down. And at one point I told your mother that the next time the train would slow down, we should try to squeeze ourselves through that window, squeeze through and jump, and maybe we would live. Your mother said, I'm too weak. I'll never make it. I can't climb. I'll never fit through that little window. I'll never be able to jump. You go. You go. You're in better shape than I am. Maybe you'll live. The next time the train slowed down, I turned to your mother and I said, please don't stay behind. Come with me. Let's go. Let's do it now. And she said, Ich kann nicht. I can't do it. You take your daughter and you go. Rabbi Bucket, I want you to know what happened next. Your mother then took me and turned me around. She brought my face close to her face. She looked me in the eye and she said, but promise me this. If you live, if you survive, and you ever meet my son, Chaya Meir, I want you to give him a message from me. Tell him, as ich hab gemacht a Zecher. I left an imprint in this world. I left a memory in this world. Tell them that our lives were not for naught, because they could never take away our memory, because our journey will go on. Tell my son, ich hab gemacht a Zecher, I left an imprint in this world. She told me these words and I never forgot them, and I grabbed my daughter, I hoisted her up through the window. We scrambled up and down the boxcar, and miracle of miracles, we survived. In all my years since then, I've wondered if you, my best friend's son, were alive. I wondered if I would ever meet you, if God would ever allow our paths to cross so that I can give you your mother's final message. And now I see you and your beautiful family, and your mother was right. She made a Zecher, she left an imprint in this world. Eila Maaseh B'nai Yisrael, these are the journeys of the children of Israel. Throughout our lives, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, they're sending us messages and they're telling us, we left an imprint in this world, we left a memory in this world, and now it's your turn. This is your time. They're depending on us to carry the legacy of their souls forward, to carry on that journey. Through us, they live on. So let's take advantage in each and every single day of our journey through a period of time of freedom, the likes of which our people have never seen. Let's take advantage of these days. Let's fill our lives with Yiddishkeit. Let's fill our children's lives, our grandchildren's lives with Yiddishkeit. And keep the memory of all the generations that came before us alive. Until indeed we're all reunited. We all come back together with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, when all of the journeys of our people will suddenly make sense. And we'll begin to understand why we went through what we went through, as our journeys all come to that very same destination in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, which should happen speedily in our days. Thank you very much.